Okay, so we're finishing up the re-encounter between God and Moses in preparation for the confrontation with Pharaoh. We saw quite a while ago the whole red story, and then we saw the encounter, and then as if it were a re-encounter, we saw an encounter all over again. So we had chapters 4 and 5 were all the preparation for the encounter with Pharaoh. And then we had an encounter with the Israelite people and the elders of the Israelites and then we had a very brief encounter with Pharaoh. And then we said, and Pharaoh said, no way. And all of a sudden it's as if Moses has gone back to God and said, Pharaoh wasn't buying it. But then we had all of chapters 6 and now 7, which were the actually the other encounter, starting way back at the difference between the two Bush stories, not the president. And now, finally, we're going to get to the plagues. And again, we're going to see inconsistencies between the two. And that will start today. So, chapter 7 now, we finished the encounter, the preparation for the encounter, and Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. And as we go along, you'll see that there's a little ellipsis down here between 13 and 19, which again, if you didn't have the ellipsis and the numbers 13 and 19, I would posit that when you go from the end of this verse to the beginning of this verse, you're not going to feel like you're missing anything until next week when you suddenly find you were missing a whole bunch of stuff, which in a way had nothing to do with where it's in the middle of. And so we've got the blood in the water story this week, ending this week. And then we have another blood in the water story next week. When we read them together, we don't really focus on the inconsistencies between the two blood and water stories. We read them as we often do, as one is sort of a general, one is a specific, or look at commentaries. But when we actually look at the text, we find that they are internally consistent and when combined, somewhat inconsistent. So we'll be looking at that. The other thing that we'll look at will be the whole issue of the staff, because the last time we had the story of a staff, it was in the red story, and God said to Moses at the bush, throw your staff down, and it turned into a serpent, into a snake. Now grab it by the tail, and it turned back into a staff. And that was Moses and the staff and the snake. And again, we read these as if they were one story totally, but in this particular version, Moses doesn't throw the staff down. Moses tells Aaron to throw the staff down. Moses doesn't throw it down, learning a magic trick from God. Aaron throws it down, and it is the magic trick. And furthermore, as we will see, what the staff turned into isn't consistent between the two stories. And so here we go. Verse 8, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor. So again, God has finished preparing them, and God says, Vayomer Adonai to Moshe and to Aharon lemor as follows. Verse 9, here's the statement from the divine message. Ki yidaber aleichem paro lemor Tenu lachem mofet, va'amarta el Aharon, kach et matcha, v'hashlech lifnei Pharaoh, yehi litanin. So this isn't actually happening yet. This is God telling Moses to tell when they go to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, show me. And then Moses will tell Aaron how to show him, and this is what will happen. So this is still preparation for the encounter. God says, Ki yedaber alechem paro, for when Pharaoh will speak to you, plural, alechem to you, plural, yedaber paro will speak Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh, Lamor, here's what God says that Pharaoh will say. So this is all preparation, and Pharaoh doesn't say it.
Where are you, Rabbi?
So we're here in the second line.
Right.
Ki yedaber alechem paro, for Pharaoh will say to you, will speak to you, Lamor, as follows. Here's what Pharaoh will say. God says, Pharaoh will say.
Okay.
Tenu lachem mofet. You, plural, will give. Imperative, give. Lachem, give yourselves, give to you. And ten lachem is, in a sense, as we would often translate, have. You will have, or show me, make me, do for me. But tenu lachem, you all, plural, will give mofet, a wonder. Mofet is a wonder. Va'amarta, and God says to, now that's the end of the internal quote of what Pharaoh will say. Now we're back to what God is saying to Moses and Aaron. And now God says to Moses, Va'amarta el Aharon, and you will say, you Moses will say to Aaron, Kach et matcha, take your staff. V'haslech, and throw it, send it out. Throw it down. Lifnei Pharaoh, before Pharaoh, Yehi letanin, and it will be, the staff will be a tanin. Remember way back in the other story when Moses, God said to Moses, throw the staff down, we're told it was turned into a serpent. But here we're told it will turn into a tanin. And we ask the very legitimate question, what is a tanin? And we have to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. When God creates the inhabitants of the waters. And the inhabitants of the waters include the Taninim, the great sea monsters. Although some translate it as crocodile, because that was the Nile sea monster. So here the staff is not turning into a snake or a serpent, it's turning into a crocodile or a sea monster.
Will you go back to uh, Kach from there?
Kach et matcha, take your staff, mateh, staff, matcha, your staff. This is what Moses says to Aaron to do. Moses will say to Aaron, take your staff and haslech bifnei Pharaoh, send it out, throw it down before Pharaoh. So Aaron takes the staff and throws it down, and it becomes a sea monster, a land shark from the old Saturday Night Live days.
Dragon.
Dragon, although it's a sea monster, it's not a giant bat monster.
Smart shark?
Well, in the old Saturday Night Live,
Yeah.
they have the old land shark routine because it's a sea monster, but they're on land.
But he was a smart shark.
So, but somehow this harkens back to, again, our coastal mythologies, which was the blue story, not our inland mythologies, which was the snake or serpent. So in that red story, in that inland story, the staff turns into a snake. But in the coastal story, it turns into some kind of sea monster or water creature.
Mhm.
And some hypothesize that that was really a word for crocodile. In any case, it's turning into something monstrous. supposed to be terrifying, not a simple turn a staff into a snake.
I
So
like this story better.
So verse 10, Vayavo Moshe Aaron el Paro, and once again we have this strange construction, Vayavo, and he came, Moses and Aaron. So again, is it Moses came and Aaron? Moses and Aaron came. And I think often you'll read translations where it is Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh. But you're getting the person wrong, you're getting the number wrong in the translation if you do it that way. So you'd have to translate, and Moses came and came Moses, or and Moses came and Aaron to Pharaoh, which then leaves Aaron without a verb. Aaron is wandering around verbless. But Vayavo Moshe va'Aharon el Paro, vaya'asu chen, ka'asher tziva Adonai, vayashlech Aharon et matehu, lifnei Pharaoh, lifnei avadav, vayehi letanin. So now Vayavo Moshe va'Aharon el Paro, Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh, and we are not told here that Pharaoh said anything to them, even though God said in the previous verse that Pharaoh would say to them. And often we expect in Hebrew that when we get to the next part of the story, we get a repetition of the earlier part of the story. So we would have expected in verse 10, they came to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, show me a wonder, show me a mofet, and then they did it. But it simply says they came to Pharaoh and they did it.
Where are you now with the
Yeah,
sentence?
So Vayavo Moshe va'Aharon el Paro.
Right. I
He
got that.
came, Moses and Aaron, to Pharaoh, and Vaya'asu chen, and they did thus. So now we're back to both of them in the verb. And they did thus, ka'asher tziva Adonai, just as God had commanded, which was verse 9. God had commanded Moses to tell Aaron to throw his staff down. But here, all of verse 9 is just incorporated in those 4 words, Vaya'asu chen ka'asher tziva. They did thus as they had been commanded by God. Vayashlech Aharon et matehu, and so Aaron sends out, throws down his staff, matehu, his staff, lifnei Pharaoh, before Pharaoh, v'lifnei avadav, and before his servants, which was not in verse 9. In verse 9, he was supposed to throw it down before Pharaoh, but now in verse 10, he throws it down before Pharaoh and all of his servants. So a lot of discussion then can be had as to are Moses and Aaron innovating something beyond which God had commanded them?
So what's
Is
leave
God
now?
telling Moses and Aaron to do a private spectacle for Pharaoh, and Moses and Aaron choose to do it in a public venue?
What's Valifne?
Before.
Before.
So they did it before Pharaoh, Vilifne Avadav, and before his servants. Vayehi Litanin, and once again it becomes some monstrous sea creature or water creature. So Pharaoh's response,
Vayehi is, and it was.
and it was Litanin, it was for a tanin, a monstrous water creature. And 11 now tells us a Pharaoh response that God did not seem to prepare them for. God says he will ask for a wonder, give him a wonder. In 10, he never asks for a wonder, and God never warns them about what Pharaoh's response to the wonder, to the magic show, will be.
Mm.
But now we get in verse 11 Pharaoh's response to the magic show. Vayikra gam paro lachachamim v'lam chashvim fim vaya'asu gam hem chartumei mitzrayim b'lahatehem ken. So Vayikra gam paro, and so Pharaoh also calls lachachamim, to his wise guys, v'lam chashvim, and to his magicians or his sorcerers or his somehow the machshvim are the besides the wise guys, he also has his court sorcerers. And he calls out to all of them, Vaya asu gam hem, and they also
just one
did.
second. So they call to his sorcerers and to who?
Chachamim, his wise guys.
Right, his wise guys. But then after that,
The mechashfim are the sorcerers. Again, it's a very rare term because this is an Egyptian hierarchy of God representatives or God's representatives. The wise men are perhaps the interpreters or the soothsayers or the oracles, and the mechashfim are then the heads of the magic schools. Or perhaps the interpreters of the divine, the various divine castings. Because then they all did, and now the Chartumim are actual magicians. You know, a magic show always has the crew who created the magic things. So maybe the Mechashfim are the creators of the magic implements, and the Chartumei are the performers. But they're the
okay.
Chartumei Mitzrayim, the performers of magic in Egypt.
I guess I'm not following you so well. I'm getting confused here.
Me too.
Vaya su is what?
They did.
Okay,
Vayasu
Also,
gam hem,
okay.
and they did also they.
that's okay.
And now who's the they? We've got Chachamim, we've got his wise men, we've got his Mechashfim, his sorcerers, and now somebody did. And who are the they? They're actually the Chartumei Mitzrayim, the Siegfried and Roy of Egypt. And they're going to, with Lahatehem, with their Lahat or Lahatim, their various showpieces, their magic implements. So with Be Lahat magic implements, Hem there, they did with their magic implements, Cain thus. In other words, they did the same thing. So they're also going to create taninim out of their staffs.
As in, I'll show you.
Yes.
You think that's great? Watch my men.
Right. So 12 is what they did. Vayashlichu, again, plural. And then the noun for the plural is ish, male singular. So again, each man took his staff, ish matehu, but it's vayashlichu, they, and they, each man took his staff. So
I don't know why I'm having trouble following you today, but I don't get the sense of each word that you're doing. You're kind of running it
okay,
in.
vayashlichu is plural.
Right.
So we expect a plural noun to be its subject. But we have a singular noun, ish, and
Right.
matehu, singular, his man took his staff. So a man took his staff, they threw it down. Doesn't seem to make sense in English.
What's the next word? Vayi.
Vayihu, and now now we're what happens to the staffs. But the Hebrew says each man, and often that's why it's usually translated in ways as each man, the Khartoumei Mitzrayim, the magicians of Egypt. They're all lined up. Siegfried and Roy, Penn and Teller, they're all lined up there. And each with his own magic technique takes their staff and throws it down. Vayhiyu, and now plural, they, that is, these staffs, they become Lataninim, they become Taninim. So if we were casting this and directing this and staging this, we would have Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. Moses would be the one who comes to Pharaoh. We would have Aaron sort of trailing him, not actually in the direct confrontation, so we'd keep that singular. But then it would be plural. Moses would turn to Aaron and say, take your staff and throw it down. And Aaron threw his staff down, and it became a monstrous water creature. Then we would have Pharaoh turn to his wise men, all of his advisors in all their different roles, the wise men advisors and the sorcerer advisors and the magician advisors or the magician performers. And Pharaoh would say to them, do it. And each of the magicians would get up and they'd have dueling magic. They'd all in their one with flash fire and one with a curtain in front of it and one with whatever. So they'd all have their own techniques and they would each throw their staff down and all of those staffs would turn into monstrous water creatures. And that's right above the number 13, Vayhiyu Litanim. So they all become monstrous water creatures. The next thing we have to deal with is the next part of the verse, Vayivla mate Aharon et matotam. Vayivla, and swallowed up. So some swallowing up is going on, and it's the mate Aharon, the staff of Aaron, swallows up all of their staffs. So everybody throws their staff down. Aaron has already done it. He's got this monstrous sea creature, this crocodile, and all of the other magicians throw their staffs down, and they become little baby crocodiles. And Aaron's crocodile walks around and swallows up all of the little baby crocodiles. That's the end of 12.
Can you say what the words were?
Yes, Vayivla, and swallowed up, Mate Aharon, the staff of Aaron, et, what they swallowed up, Matotam, their staffs. That is the staffs of the Khartoumei Mitzrayim.
Thank you.
Pharaoh's response to all this apparently is a response to the fact that they can all do it, not a response to the fact that Aaron's staff is able to swallow up all of their little baby crocodiles. That their staffs are quite less powerful. One would say impotent against the staff of Aaron. Pharaoh's response, Vayechazak lev paro, v'lo shama aleihem ka'asher diber Adonai. And Vayechazak comes from the word chazak, which means strong. So this is usually translated as hardened, but really it's strengthened. So the Lev Paro, the heart of Pharaoh, was strengthened. But it doesn't say strengthened about what. just says he was strengthened. His heart remained strong, became strong, was strong, depending on how you want to translate that yechazak. But however it was, the lo shama alehem, and he did not, once again, hear, listen, heed, pay attention to, all of that in the word shama, which we usually translate as listen or hear. But he did not listen to them. He did not hear them. He did not heed them. And once again, alehem is plural, which means Moses and Aaron. So we're flipping back and forth between Moses and a singular verb and Moses and Aaron and a plural verb.
But Rabbi Sam, strengthening his heart it's like strengthening his will or his mind, not his compassion, right?
Right.
Is that
And
correct?
this is the question of, did he strengthen his own heart or did God strengthen his heart?
Okay. Thank you.
The answer is always yes.
In the red story, we're told God says to Moses, I'm going to do it to Pharaoh so I can show off. But in the blue story, it seems that Pharaoh is doing it for himself. So we could translate vayechazak and caused to be strong his heart, but it doesn't still doesn't tell us who caused it. Or we can translate it as heart was strengthened, or his heart was strong. So this little show didn't impress him, apparently. Whatever happened, it didn't impress him. And we have this little tagline, Ka'asher diber Adonai, just as God had said. Every time we see this Ka'asher diber Adonai, sometimes I put it in black, sometimes I put it in blue, because we don't know if that was part of the original story or if that was added by the editor. Because remember, it's in the red story that Moses and Aaron are warned that Pharaoh's not going to pay attention to them. In the blue story, without it, we simply have a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh remains hard, strong. And we don't know if there's an influence of God in this or not. And scholars are on different sides of what was added and by whom. There's no way of knowing without getting the original scroll that Ezra had in front of him. Long since gone. But now, they've shown off. They've done their stuff. Pharaoh doesn't pay attention to them. And we jump down to verse 19 and we hear, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe Amor el Aharon Kach et matcha unete yadcha al meimei Mitzrayim al naharotam al yeorehem v'al agmehem v'al kol mikveh meimehem v'hiyu dam v'haya dam b'chol eretz Mitzrayim uva'etzim uva'avanim. And then this will conclude next week with verse 20, when they do it. But here it seems that we can read from, they show off the magic staff and the crocodile and the power of that crocodile and that staff. And Pharaoh doesn't pay attention. So then God says, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, and God says to Moses, Amor el Aharon, say to Aaron, Kach matcha, take your staff. So this is just a continuation of the staff power. Unete yadcha, and nete is spread out. Stretch out, stretch forth. Stretch your staff over yadcha, your hand, stretch your hand, with obviously the staff in it, because it said, take your staff. The only way to take a staff is with your hand. So take your staff and stretch it out, al meimei Mitzrayim, over or on the waters of Egypt. Now, if we go back to Cecil B. DeMille, Moses stretches his hand out over the waters with the staff. But in this story, Aaron, at Moses' direction, stretches his hand out over the water. And when you read verses 14 to 18 next week, you'll see that Moses does it. And Moses does it in a different way than Aaron does it at Moses' command.
So there's two competing stories here?
Yep. But you'll notice that the staff trick didn't work part one. So God says, okay, ready for part two. Scene two. And again, if you didn't have the numbering and the ellipsis, you wouldn't feel like there was anything missing in between. Do the staff trick. Pharaoh's not impressed. Okay, I got another staff trick for you that Aaron's going to do at Moses' direction. So Aaron is going to take the staff, stretch it out over the waters of Egypt. And what are the waters of Egypt?
The Nile.
Harotam, that is their rivers or streams, over Yeorehem. And Yeor in the blue story is always the Nile. It's the river. So stretch your staff out over the waters and stretch it out over the streams and the Nile and the Agmehem and their ponds. I'll call mikveh mehem. Mikveh mayim is a gathering of water. So all the puddles, the ponds, the pools, the lakes, the streams, the river. Stretch your hand out over all of that. Vayihiyu dam, and there will be blood. It doesn't say the water will become blood. It actually says, stretch your hand out over all the waters.
The mayhem is what again?
May is mayim of, waters of.
Okay.
Mayhem, their waters. So the mikveh mayhem. So the waters are the Naharot, the streams, the Yaor, the Nile, the river, the Agamam, the Agamim, the ponds or the pools or the lakes, the Mikveh Mayim, any place where water gathers, the gathering of the waters. And again, this language takes us back to Genesis chapter 1. Because if you'll recall way back in Genesis chapter 1, when God creates land, God makes mikveh mayim, gatherings of waters, which the land separates the different gatherings of the waters. And again, a coastal people would be talking about rivers and lakes and ponds and pools and swamps and puddles. The internal is just going to have the water, the river. Internal language will use language, the internal people will use language like wadis, or as we said in Arizona, river gulches. Coastal people will talk about lakes and ponds and rivers and streams and swamps and bayous and deltas. So in this story, we've got all the different kinds of waters. And there will be blood. The hayadam, and the blood will be. Where will the blood be? Bechol eretz, in all the land of Egypt. Bechol eretz Mitzrayim, in all the land. There will be blood, not in the water. The water's not blood. The land is blood. Because remember, the land is naturally irrigated and much wetter than an inland place would be. So all the waterings of the land will be blood. B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, in all the land of Egypt, and the blood will be uva etzim, in the trees. The blood will be dripping down from the trees. And uva avanim, and the stones will be weeping water. The stones will sweat water. And the reason I translate etzim as tree wood is because avanim are the building materials. So it's not just the trees, but all the things you built out of the trees, all your wood will seep out blood. All of Egypt will become a bloody mess. We usually read this as red tide, but that's because we read the red story as more dominant than the blue story. But here in this story, there will be blood from Aaron doing the staff, and the blood will be everywhere. All the gatherings of water and all the things that are irrigated or that contain water. So the land will seep up water, blood rather than water. The wood and the stone will sweat water, not condensation of sweat blood rather, not condensation of water. So every place that there's condensation, it'll be blood, not water. So the blue text is quite a bit more descriptive of a watery area. Next week, after they do it all, you're going to read verses 14 to 18, which talks about Pharaoh's heart now being kaved, not chazak. So we'll talk about that next week, but you can look at the translations and you'll see the different point of view and the different way in which things happen in the blood story, ending with the Nile is bloody. Not the wood, not the stone, not the land. The Nile is bloody, and the fish die, and the Nile stinks. And this is where we get that whole historical, maybe this was a red tide. But if you look at 14 to 18 and then look back at the blue story of 13 and then 19, you're going to see that the blood has a very different place and effect and system. And as you'll see, how does the blood come about in this story will be a different way of the staff and the blood. So just you'll be comparing that. But for now, this is how you will read next week.
Hang on 1 second. Go. Okay.
Which is the other half of verse 20. And then, because the way it's actually written, we go from 13, the crocodile story, to a blood story, which is 14 to 18. Then we get 19 and 20 from last week stuck into the middle of, you'll notice there's an ellipsis here, where all of a sudden that stuff from 19 and 20 is stuck back here in the middle.
Hmm.
So it goes from blue last week to red to blue to red. But the stories make more sense in the order in which I gave them, which is the end of last week, and then backtrack to that week. So here's the reading of it all. Vayasu chen Moshe v'Aharon kasher tziva Adonai vayarem bamateh vayach et hamayim asher bayaor le'enei Faro ule'enei avadav. So they did it. Now, all of a sudden, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe kaved lev Paro me'ein l'shalach ha'am. 15. Lech el Paro baboker hine yotze hamaima v'nitzavta likrato al sfat hayaor v'hamateh asher nehefach lenachash tikach biadecha. So all of a sudden it's Moses's staff, you'll see, and it's now a serpent and not a crocodile. So notice all of that again as we're reading the story. But when you read it straight through, it goes back and forth and you don't really pay attention to it as much. The rabbis did, and thus a lot of commentary. Reading for further on 16. Va'amarta elav Adonai Elohei ha'ivrim shalachani elecha lemor shalach et ami vayavduni bamidbar v'hine lo shamata ad ko. 17. Ko amar Adonai bezot teda ki ani Adonai hine anochi makeh b'mateh asher biyadi al hamayim asher bayaor v'nehefchu ledam. 18. V'hadaga asher bayaor tamut uva'ash hayaor v'nil u mitzrayim lishtot mayim min hayaor. And then vayehafchu all hamayim asher bayaor ladam. And once again, as you're reading this and you read from the end of 18 to the second half of 20, you won't feel like, if you didn't know the numbers and see the ellipsis, you wouldn't feel like there was any disconnect between the end of verse 18 and then the second half of verse 20. All of that to look forward to.
Well, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
All right. And so have a good week. Enjoy the
Shavua
90s
tov.
and get ready for the thunderstorms that the 90-degree weather will bring us. And have a nice summer before it becomes winter again in the next week.
Have a great week, everyone. Thank you.
Here we are in
Thank
New
you.
England.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Say hi
Bye-bye.
to Jenny.
I will.
Bye-bye.